Welcome. My name is Esteban Del Rio. I'm a professor here in the Department of Communication and the director of the Francis G. Harpst Center for Catholic Thought and Culture. I'm new to this role. Some of you might know Jeffrey Burns, who is the previous director, a friend and fellow traveler and ongoing advisor. So I'm really happy to continue some of the excellence that he cultivated as director of the Harpst Center, and in a tradition of bringing really kind of engaging, relevant conversations to our campus. The Harpst Center stands out among other similar centers nationally in Catholic higher education. We aim to animate disciplinary and transdisciplinary teaching and research by focusing on the intellectual, aesthetic, and practical dimensions of Catholic thought and culture. We do this through shared experiences, as well as catalysts from within and from outside of the university in the form of speakers and conversations. Father Christopher Kellerman is such a catalyst. We are excited to continue to join with you as the Harpst Center begins its next chapter, with myself at the helm, Jeffrey on call, my colleagues Sharon Cayetano and Isabel Solis from the Harpst Center, and all of us working in mission integration, and in the university, many faculty and staff colleagues. I'm really happy you're here and happy to be here with you. Christopher Kellerman was born in Arlington, Texas, where he graduated from Lamar High School in 2004. Father Chris is a Rangers fan, so unlike us Padres fan, he had quite a good October into November. And he's a superstitious baseball fan, which I don't know, for a Jesuit, is that in character or out of character? Either you have faith in God that it's all going to work out, or you got to sit in the right place in the living room, or watch online instead of the television. But I'm really happy for, despite my own misgivings about the last baseball season, I'm very happy for Father Chris and his Rangers. He and his older brother spent most of their childhood watching professional wrestling on television, but Chris also found time to play the piano, as well as become a political junkie at a young age. He then attended Texas Tech University in Lubbock, where he studied music and political science and was an active member of the Catholic Student Association. He went on to earn his master's degree in theology from the University of Dallas, where he began seriously discerning a religious vocation. He entered the Jesuit novitiate in 2011, and after spending 2 years in Grand Coteau, Louisiana, studied philosophy in St. Louis and worked for a year at St. Louis University High School. Chris did his regency at Regis Jesuit High School in Aurora, Colorado, and then earned his Master's of Divinity degree at Regis at the University of Toronto. So Father Kellerman has been a teacher of history. He's worked in pastoral ministry and secondary education. He worked as a visiting fellow and interim executive director of the Jesuit Social Research Institute at University of Loyola, New Orleans, and currently serves as the Secretary of Justice and Ecology at the Jesuit Conference in Washington, D.C. His book, All Oppression Shall Cease, A History of Slavery, Abolitionism, and the Catholic Church, was published last year and won a Catholic Media Association Award for first-time authors. The book was also a finalist for the Paul Lovejoy Prize from the Journal of Global Slavery. I'm honored to share these moments with you and to introduce Father Christopher Kellerman. I like all this stuff.
Thank you, Esteban, and thank you everybody for being here. We're going to talk about a lot of tough stuff tonight, a lot of tough history, and so I would like to begin with a prayer. This works. Okay. Let's not worry about the clicker for right now. It's all right. I got this thing. Fine. Good. All right. Now, in 1866, after the American Civil War, there was a group of musicologists who gathered all of the known spirituals, all of the known African American spirituals. And in their book, there was one that they thought was of Catholic origin. It was sung by enslaved Black Catholics. And that was because it mentioned Mary. As our opening prayer this evening, I'm going to sing this once so that you can hear the melody. Then we'll do the sign of the cross. And I would love it if for our prayer, you sang with me this prayer to Mary that was composed by enslaved Black Catholics. So here's the melody. Here's the melody. I want some valiant soldier here. I want some valiant soldier here. I want some valiant soldier here to help me bear the cross. Oh, hail Mary, hail. Oh, hail Mary, hail. Oh, hail Mary, hail, to help me bear the cross. So let us pray together in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. I want some valiant soldier here. I want some valiant soldier here. I want some valiant soldier here to help me bear the cross. Oh, hail Mary, hail. Oh, hail Mary, hail. Oh, hail Mary, hail, to help me bear the cross. Amen. I want to begin with this chart. This chart shows in the year 1760, at that time, the number of enslaved people owned by my religious order, the Society of Jesus. So perhaps most well known about Jesuit slaveholding was their sale of 272 people. The Maryland Jesuits selling 272 people in an effort to help Georgetown stay afloat in 1837, I believe it was, or 1838. But that was kind of a drop in the bucket compared to Jesuit slaveholding throughout the world. Because 70 years prior to that, the Society of Jesus owned almost 21,000 people. 21,000 people. Just to give you an idea, today in the Jesuits, there are 14,000 Jesuits throughout the world. But at this point in our history alone, almost 21,000. Tonight, I want to ask this question. How did this happen? How did this happen? Did anybody think it was wrong? And what did the Pope say about all of this Jesuit slaveholding? In order to understand this and answer these questions, we've got to go way far back in history and talk about the ancient world. Slavery was a widespread practice in the ancient world, and it's even mentioned in the Hebrew scriptures in the Old Testament. Abraham is a slaveholder. Abraham and Sarah use Hagar as their enslaved sexual property. Some of the other patriarchs, like Jacob, it says, are slaveholders. The law of Moses has legislation regulating slaveholding, but allowing the Hebrew people to engage in slaveholding. And there's a separate set of laws in the Torah for Hebrews who become slaves to other Hebrews. It says that they shouldn't really even be treated as slaves. They should be treated well. And they should only be enslaved for 6 years and then released. But then foreign slaves who come to be owned by the Hebrew people can be passed down from generation to generation and can be treated harshly, it says. Compared to other cultures at the time, really, that's just about the same. That's the same as how other ancient societies treated their foreign slaves. But it's there in the Old Testament. There were different ideas at the time of why slavery was a practice. One of the most famous was Aristotle. Aristotle said that there are some people who are naturally slaves. There are some people who are naturally born to be slaves by some aspect of their body, maybe, or their mind. But Rome, the Roman Empire, rejected this idea. They said, no, nobody's born to be a slave. Everybody's born to be free, the Roman law said. However, some people just end up as slaves. And that's not natural, but it's what happens. And Rome is very okay with that because they have a massive slave trade in Rome. The Roman Empire had a massive slave economy. And so in Roman law, in the law of ancient Rome, there are 3 ways by which somebody can become a slave to a Roman. The first is through being captured in a war. The second is through being born to an enslaved mother. So the status of the mother determined the status of her children. A free mother gave birth to free children. An enslaved mother gave birth to enslaved children. And then 3, let's say you were a Roman going off to another country and you encountered a slave market. You could purchase someone and bring them back. In other words, it didn't really matter how they became enslaved. You could bring them back. These were the 3 ways by which someone became a slave in ancient Rome. A Roman, a free Roman, whether they were a citizen or not, because you could be a free person in the Roman Empire but not technically be a Roman citizen. Any free person in the Roman Empire could never become a slave. It was against the law. It was impossible. You couldn't be a slave in ancient Rome if you were a free person. So, in other words, only foreigners were slaves in the Roman Empire. And this system right here becomes the context for slaveholding in the New Testament. When we see Jesus meet a Roman centurion who says, I have a beloved slave who is dying, can you heal him? When in the Acts of the Apostles, enslaved people are encountered by the apostles. In the letters of St. Paul, where he says, slaves, be obedient to your masters as you would be obedient to Christ. These are the types of people we need to be thinking about. People who were captured during a war as prisoners of war, people who were born to enslaved women who were captured in wars, or somebody who was purchased, overseas, as it were. Those are the types of people that become slaves and that are slaves in the New Testament, because the Holy Land was an occupied part of the Roman Empire. And so Roman law applied there. Roman law applied there. Notice here, I keep mentioning that slaves would have been foreigners. And that's really true in the Old Testament as well, right? That the true slaves were non-Hebrews. So slavery at this time has an association with foreignness, but not necessarily with what we today talk about as race. Race is going to be a later construction and a later way to associate slavery with Black Africans. But at this time, in ancient Rome, you would have seen slaves of all different skin colors and of many different nationalities. But one thing that would have been in common with all of them would have been that they were foreigners, that they weren't Roman. So you see something that's like close to the idea of race, but not quite, and an important distinction there. And I do want to mention that this was what we call chattel slavery. This was chattel slavery. So chattel simply means movable property. This water bottle is chattel. I can sell it to you and you can take it home. This land that we are upon is not chattel. You can't move it, right? So that's all that being a chattel slave means, is that I can sell you to somebody else and they can take you home. The slavery of the New Testament, the slavery of Aristotle, the slavery of the Roman Empire is chattel slavery. The Catholic Church from early on is going to adopt Roman law as the way by which it understands its own slaveholding. And with that, as we move into the era of the medieval era in medieval Europe, church theologians are going to defend slavery as being something that is okay for a Christian to do. St. Augustine of Hippo says that slavery is a way by which God punishes sinners. That it's one of the methods that God uses to punish people for sinning. Now, think about this. What would then abolishing slavery do? You'd be taking a method away from God to punish people. Right? So Augustine is kind of the church fathers, I think of him as being the most pro-slavery of all of them. And everybody else is kind of in a range on the other side of Augustine. He's the most pro-slavery, I think. Pope Gregory the Great, he was pretty pro-slavery too, because he was a slaveholder. He had enslaved teenagers that he gave to his friends as gifts. And did not seem to think that, this doctor, these are two doctors of the church, we call them. One of those, Gregory the Great, considered one of the greatest popes of all time, and was a slaveholder himself. St. Thomas Aquinas also defends slavery as being something that, and he mentions, well, it's accepted by canon law, church law at the time. He quotes Aristotle, he quotes the Roman law, and he says that, the status of an enslaved woman should pass down to her enslaved child. So even Aquinas finds this all right. Local and ecumenical councils will use slavery as a punishment. So the Ninth Council of Toledo that was overseen by, the Fourth Council of Toledo that was overseen by Saint Isidore of Seville said that women who were caught living with priests could be sold into slavery by the bishop. A later Council of Toledo said that if they had children, those children could become permanent enslaved property of the church. This gets put into canon law collections that are universally approved by the popes. So it becomes universal applicable law for the church. It doesn't mean that a bishop has to sell somebody into slavery, but it's an option available to him through the church. And ecumenical councils use slavery as a punishment as well. So it's even in ecumenical, universal, the most important councils of the church that allow for slavery as a punishment. In that situation, it's a little different. It has to do with the Crusades, but it's part of it. We do have some examples of popes in the first century condemning certain instances of slavery. So one thing that was pretty much universally condemned was kidnapping somebody without a just reason and then selling them into slavery. What does that mean? So if I'm in a war that my country has declared, I can capture prisoners of war and sell them into slavery. But I can't just go to somebody's house and take them and make them a slave, like just on a random day, okay? And so there are moments in which Christians, free Christians, are being kidnapped and sold into slavery. And the popes will critique that. They'll say that's wrong. But the thing is, everybody would have thought that was wrong, right? So it's sort of like it would be sort of like today, and this isn't by any means a bad thing, but like today when the popes, Pope Francis condemns human trafficking, right? People aren't like shocked by it. It's like, well, yeah, everybody thinks human trafficking is wrong, okay? These would be situations that universally speaking were condemned. You can't take a free person, kidnap them, and make them a slave. It's a subtle distinction, but it's important because later on, there's going to be popes that point to these moments and say that this was evidence that we were against slavery the whole time. That's not true. This is certain instances where free Christians are turned into slaves. Does that make sense? Important distinction. Okay, so what we have then in the medieval era and at the beginning of the so-called Age of Discovery is that slaveholding is a Catholic endorsed practice. Almost all the theologians of the early church have accepted it and defended it. It has been approved by canon law, and it has been approved by both local and ecumenical councils and by doctors of the church, right? It is part of the Catholic way of life. There was a myth promoted in the 17th, 18th century that slavery disappeared in Europe during the medieval era. This is totally false. Don't ever let anybody tell you that. It's not true. Slavery was always present in Europe. And that's important to recognize. It wasn't something that the church was never on like some campaign to get rid of slavery until way, 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 way later, but certainly not during this time. Bringing us then to the Atlantic slave trade. Okay. So there's this moment late in the era of the Crusades in which there becomes not just a crusade for the Holy Land, but also for the Iberian Peninsula that is going to be called by the Spanish the Reconquest, which is a debatable term. But the point being, there's a long period of time where Spain and Portugal, that territory, is ruled by Muslims, is ruled by Muslim leaders. And what happens is that Christians start to say, no, this is our land, and they start pushing Muslim forces out of Spain and Portugal. Okay, the Christians in Portugal accomplish that goal first before Spain does. And so Prince Henry the Navigator, who is the prince of Portugal at this time, he wants to keep going. He wants to keep fighting against these Muslim forces in North Africa. And he's going to do it by sailing around the Cape of Africa, sailing around the western part south of Cape Bojador. And he wants to get rich. He wants to find trading partners. And he wants to find Christian rulers in Africa who will join his fight against Islam. Now, may surprise you to hear that. Wait a minute. Portugal knew that thought there were Christians in Africa? Yeah, Christianity always knew that there were Christians in Africa. Can you think of a Black African in the New Testament? Anybody? The Ethiopian eunuch, converted in the Acts of the Apostles. Ethiopian, universally at the time, means Black African. So we have Black African Christians in the New Testament. This was not a crazy idea. There were Black Christians at the time in Europe. There was an ancient practice here. And so Henry wants to find some of them. And so he starts to do this, but he also begins conducting slave raids. Now, this is exactly what I said a few minutes ago. Everybody knew at the time was wrong. He and his men will show up at an island, like one of the Canary Islands, will get to a small village and ambush it and just take the people there and enslave them. Now, these are dangerous expeditions. Some of his men get hurt or die in them, but he then takes them back to Portugal. That begins in about 1444. Now, as I said, he has no justification for doing this. The people that he kidnaps are not Muslim. So there's not even like oh, this is my crusade going on. And so really, most Catholic theologians at the time would have condemned that and said, he can't do that. But there was one tradition in medieval canon law that did allow it. And apparently that was the tradition of Pope Nicholas V. Because he, in 2 papal bulls, explicitly gives the thumbs up to Portugal for doing this. He gives them the right to take all lands and possessions of non-Christians in Africa, of non-Christians, to continue conducting these slave raids, and he gives them exclusive trading rights with Africans, which would have made Spain mad. That's what that's about. Spain and Portugal at this time are fighting over everything. And so a few years later, the popes are going to give Spain the Americas, right? But right now, Portugal gets Africa. Now that, I should say, like Thomas Aquinas, okay, in his theology, he would not have thought these bulls were good. He would have said they were totally unjust because Thomas's theology didn't allow for just taking land of non-Christians without any justification. But there was a certain tradition that did allow this, and Pope Nicholas was really the first person to ever use it. Several popes after him will renew these permissions for Portugal. And that begins the Atlantic slave trade. That's the beginning of it. Things will take a big turn. At first, everybody's just being shipped to Portugal, to Lisbon. But then Spain starts purchasing enslaved people from the Portuguese, which they're totally allowed to do. And they start shipping people to the New World in 1501. By the end of the transatlantic trade, by the time the very last ship legally crosses the Atlantic Ocean in 1866, 12.5 million Africans will have been forcibly placed on ships to Europe or the Americas. 10.7 million will survive that journey because about 1.8 million will die on board due to diseases or homicide or suicide. Nearly half of that number will have been transported on Portuguese ships. As we know, other countries start getting involved in the trade. But Portugal and Brazil remain the major players. And let's not forget, the condition of the mother passes down to her children. So there's not just 12.5 million victims of the trade, there's all their descendants who are automatically considered slaves in canon law as well. So just as an example here, the United States participation in the slave trade, in the Atlantic slave trade, the United States purchased about 400,000 people in the trade. 400,000 out of that 10.7 million. But due to their descendants, right? Due to the practices in US slavery of basically using women as machines for breeding. Over the course of US history, one historian estimates that there were 10 million enslaved people throughout the scope of US history. So starting from 400,000 to 10 million, right? So way more than 12.5 million victims of the trade. But that distinction between the first people that are brought over, the 12.5 million that are brought over, and their descendants is going to be really important in Catholic theology and even in civil law. But we'll get to that in a moment. Okay, this is obviously super depressing, right? And it would be really nice to be able to say, well, you know, back then things were different. Slavery was okay. Everybody was doing it. Nobody knew it was wrong. What's the problem? You know, why are we looking at the past through the eyes of modern people that think slavery is wrong? That's not true. We actually know that for centuries prior to that, there were people that said slavery was wrong. Aristotle's whole philosophy of slavery begins with him saying, now there are some people who say that slavery is morally wrong. So that means Aristotle knew people that thought slavery was wrong. Philo writes about two groups, the Essenes, a Jewish group, and a strange group called the Therapeutai, that he says did not practice slaveholding because they believed that all people were children of God and that it was wrong to hold another person as a slave. St. Gregory of Nyssa was the only church father that we know of that's been recognized as a church father who said that slavery was wrong. He preached homilies against it. There was an abbot named Smaragdus in the 9th century who writes a treatise saying that slavery is wrong. And John Duns Scotus, a contemporary of Aquinas, says that slavery is monstrous and is something that no Christian should participate in. Therefore, we just can't say that nobody knew it was wrong back then, or nobody thought it was wrong back then. People were thinking about it actively. They're writing about it. And some people are saying slavery is evil. All right. So that's one group of like theological, I call these the theological abolitionists. They leave no room for slaveholding in their theology. And we also want to remember that, you know, it's not like enslaved Africans were enjoying what was happening to them. So 1460, very early on in the slave trade, in the Portuguese slave trade, Lisbon in Portugal has to ban public gatherings of enslaved Africans because when they are getting together on feast days, they're making plans to escape. In 1502, just 1 year after Spain starts shipping enslaved Africans to the New World, they start rebelling and fleeing and teaming up with indigenous people on Hispaniola, present-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic. In 1518, there's these groups called confraternities, sort of like our present-day Knights of Columbus or Knights of Peter Claver, groups that, like Catholic groups that are spiritual brotherhood, commitment to one another. There's confraternities at this time that Africans are part of, that they're allowed to be a part of, enslaved Africans included, and they petition the King of Portugal to allow their members to sue for their freedom. All three of these right here, all three of these examples are all baptized Catholics. So there are enslaved Black Catholics fighting against their enslavement because it's horrible, right? Being a slave is horrible. Okay, Now, I mentioned there's some theological abolitionists, right, that say all slavery is wrong whatsoever. But there's another argument, another way that some theologians start attacking the slave trade. And that's by saying, slavery itself isn't necessarily wrong, but that Atlantic slave trade, that African slave trade, it's wrong. It's operating unjustly. It's operating, it's doing evil things. An example, let's think of it this way. Like, I might say that owning a kitchen knife, there's nothing wrong with owning a sharp kitchen knife, right? But what if I say, well, I'm going to sell it to a kindergartner, right? And like not tell his parents or something. You'd be like, oh gosh, that's crazy, right? That's terrible. Okay. So something you might say, these people saw it in something like that. Like slavery itself isn't wrong, but this particular instance of it called the Atlantic slave trade, evil, 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 immoral. Okay. And that's what Bartolomé de las Casas is going to first argue. He's going to say that the Atlantic slave trade was operating unjustly because people were being kidnapped, rather than arguing against slavery itself. Las Casas was known, he's a Dominican. He becomes the Bishop of Chiapas in Mexico. And Las Casas is known as a big defender of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. He's fighting for their freedom and saying these conquistadors cannot enslave them. But he is also at the same time saying, okay, yeah, we don't want to enslave these indigenous people, but we also don't want to work. So what we ought to do, and he suggests this to the king, is import Black Africans and have them work. Now that might sound crazy, like how could he think that way? But that would have made complete sense to a European theologian at the time. And in fact, his argument worked. In 1542, Carlos V, Emperor of Spain, bans the enslavement of indigenous peoples in the Americas. And Carlos V also had been, for decades prior to that, allowing enslaved Africans to be imported. But in the year 1547, Las Casas goes to Lisbon to research this African slave trade because he started hearing rumors that it's not operating as the Portuguese say that it is. And when he reads about it, it totally changes his mind. And he says, oh my gosh, European greed and demand is just causing people to be kidnapped, either by Portuguese themselves or African merchants, in order to meet that demand, are going and kidnapping people. Because by this time, Portugal's really just buying. That whole slave raiding thing wasn't working well for them because people were fighting back against them. And so they just start buying enslaved people instead. And Las Casas says, no, this is evil. This could not possibly be right. He doesn't become an abolitionist. He doesn't say slavery itself is wrong, but he says that the slave trade, he says, contains 1,000 mortal sins and must be stopped. Other priests after him, very shortly after him, will argue the same thing, and that will just continue and continue and continue. That the African slave trade is operating unjustly and should be stopped. Unfortunately, some theologians come along and fight against that argument. And the big leaders of that are the Jesuits. Father Luis de Molina is a very important Spanish theologian in the early modern era. He writes the first full-length treatise on the slave trade. And in it, he totally admits what Las Casas and others are saying. He says, yes, some Africans are being unjustly enslaved. They're just being kidnapped. And he says, and that's evil. That shouldn't be happening. But Molina says, but some are being justly enslaved, namely the ones being captured by the Portuguese in their wars. Because the Portuguese do start wars at this time. such as for Angola. And he says those are definitely okay. But he admits this, that there's some bad things going on. And he says, but here's the deal. Let's say that you're in, let's say that you're a homeowner in Bahia, Brazil, and you go to a slave market. Well, you're going to see a big mix of enslaved people for sale. How are you going to know who's been enslaved justly and who's not? He says, well, you need to investigate, but you should consider the person a slave until you have proven otherwise. So it's like guilty until proven innocent, right? He says, but you should investigate if you wonder. Now, who can you ask? You could ask the merchant, right? But what's the merchant going to say? Oh, yeah, this is illegal. No. So that's not going to work very well. But Melina doesn't seem to recognize this. Of course, the other person you could ask would be the enslaved person. Melina says, don't believe them, they'll lie. It's so crazy, it is almost like you almost do want to laugh because it sounds so nuts, but unfortunately, this becomes a major way of defending participation in the trade. There was this old idea that Jesuits were very compassionate to consciences and in confessions and that kind of thing. Compassionate toward who? Compassionate toward who? All right. So Molina's treatise is going to be very popular, very influential. The Spanish government's going to be quoting it 8 decades from then. Let's talk about another Jesuit named Alonso de Sandoval. Sandoval is ministering to enslaved people in Cartagena, and he writes this book about Africans in the Americas. In many respects, it's a very cool text. It's kind of like a sociology of African communities in the Americas. And there's a lot of really neat things about it. He goes into their different traditions. He's trying to show Europeans like all Africans aren't the same, They have different countries and different traditions, different religions, different foods. And so it's a really neat text, except he goes into a discussion of the slave trade. And he basically just says what Molina says. He quotes Molina. He says, don't believe slaves, they'll lie. And he defends participating in the trade. But then he goes one step beyond Molina. He starts applying explicitly racist theories, something that Molina didn't do. Molina, in a sense, didn't need to do that. But Sandoval does. He says, well, maybe when Noah, and he wasn't the first person to write this kind of idea, but he was the first to put it in a theological text from everything that I can see. He says, well, when Noah cursed Canaan, his grandson, the son of Ham in Scripture, after Ham finds Noah drunk and naked in his tent, Noah says, Canaan, you will be cursed, you will be a servant to your brothers. Canaan being the son of Ham, Husan. Sandoval says, well, maybe these Africans, they're the descendants of Canaan. And so God has punished them with the curse of slavery. And the sign of that curse is their blackness. So Sandoval equates blackness with a curse from God. And he says in another point, these Africans, they might be what Aristotle was talking about when he said that some people were naturally born to be slaves because they're so good at their work. Now think about what this does. It's saying the standards are different for Africans. right? The standards that we usually apply to why somebody can become a slave or not are different from these Black people because they're born differently and therefore different standards apply, or because God has cursed them with this. And who's going to argue with the judgment of God? So as you can imagine, these are very damaging theories that Sandoval writes. And again, if we think like, oh, that's just how people thought back then, I've already found evidence from before this period in print that people were saying, this is a crazy theory that's going around. Scripture says that Africans are sons of Cush, not of Canaan. This doesn't make any sense. And nowhere in Scripture does it say that somebody was cursed with blackness. So this had already been debunked, but Sandoval puts it in there. And his treatise is going to become really, really popular as well. And he's going to train somebody to replace him in his mission there in Cartagena, St. Peter Claver. Peter Claver is going to promote Sandoval's book. He's going to beg the superior general to let it be published. There is no evidence that Peter Claver ever criticized the slave trade, despite the fact that there had been many other priests who had. He, in fact, participated in the slave trade and gave money to Spanish merchants who were going to Africa and said, buy me some Black slaves who can serve as my interpreters in my ministry. He was violent, threatening, shaming as a slaveholder. And he would convince people who are running away to return to their masters. Now, if you know the Catholic world, you know that Peter Claver is thought of as like the patron saint of racial justice. So it's like, whoa, how did this happen? Well, think of it this way. You've got your theologian who comes up with an argument for participating in the slave trade that just relies on weird moral reasoning. You've got another one who comes up with a reason for participating in the slave trade using racist arguments. And then you have this man who's ministering to the enslaved and is known for being, very personally virtuous. And he also owns some of them. What's going on here, right? You start promoting him. You start promoting him as the ideal. This is how you really take care of enslaved people, like Peter Claver does. And then that gets you here. Right? If Peter Claver is the example, rather than, let's say, Bartolome de las Casas, what does that allow you to do? Continue participating in the slave trade. All right. The protests continued, though. Remember those Black Catholic confraternities that were suing for their freedom in 1518? They keep on going. In the 1680s, they send 2 representatives from Brazil all the way across the ocean and through Europe to go and beg the Pope to condemn the slave trade. Pope Innocent XI. And at the same time, remarkably, there are these 2 Capuchin priests that are doing the exact same thing. They've been excommunicated by the Bishop of Havana for preaching against the slave trade. And Francisco Jose de Jaca and Epifanio de Morans. Morans is a canon lawyer. He's like, you don't have the authority to do that. And the bishop's like, ooh, maybe he's right. And so he's like, okay, you're not excommunicated anymore, but you can't minister here. And Morans is like, that's crazy. So he says, we're going to go to Rome and figure this out. And but he has to stay in prison in Spain. And while he's there, he writes this incredible treatise against Molina directly, against the Society of Jesus, against Spain, against Portugal, using all these amazing arguments to say why the slave trade is wrong. And they take this to the Pope as well. And unfortunately, the Pope decides not to act. there's a small doctrinal clarification that is issued saying that the slave trade should be operating legally, which doesn't solve any problem at all. Even Molina said that. And so it's very weak. People at the time recognize it as weak. It's a grave disappointment. It's a great disappointment. And that next century will be when the slave trade reaches its peak. Eventually, we will finally get a public condemnation from a pope of the slave trade. All right, 1808. Remember how I talked about that distinction between the immediate victims of the trade and their descendants? In 1808, both Britain and the United States banned participation in the international slave trade. In other words, no more purchasing of Africans from Africa. That's under Thomas Jefferson that this ban happens. And of course, we know that Jefferson was a slaveholder, right? And everybody knew that he was a slaveholder at the time. Jefferson said this was such a great moment to be signing this because the African slave trade was evil. But they had this idea that, like, yeah, so Sally Hemings, maybe her great grandmother was unjustly enslaved, but then her children and grandchildren were justly enslaved because they were born to an enslaved woman. Now, the logic there is a little messy at points, but this was a very common argument at the time that both Britain and the US are making. And they want to say, look, in the slave trade, we'll worry about the issue of slavery later. And that's kind of what Jefferson says too. So Britain then abolishes slavery in most of its empire in 1834, but not all of it, and then goes to Pope Gregory XVI and asks him if he will also condemn the slave trade, just as Britain has and the US have done. And Gregory XVI apparently was like, it was a no-brainer. And he was like, sure, of course. Which is kind of remarkable. It's one of the things that has just baffled me as I do this research. Because he did not use new arguments. He did not have any new information. All the arguments that he uses as to why the slave trade is evil were the same ones used by Las Casas. So he doesn't condemn slavery itself, just the international trade, as Las Casas did, as Morans did. And like Jefferson and Britain, he doesn't say, you know, now everybody needs to emancipate their slaves. He doesn't say that. But it's like, why was he the first one to do this, you know? And it just seems like I don't know, he just had the courage to do it, I guess. And people were really mad at the time. Portugal was really mad. Brazil was really mad, but he did it. However, and this might be a little bit of why he didn't have any trouble saying yes to Britain's request. It seems, and I have seen the files from the Vatican, it seems that Gregory really did think that the church had always been against this slave trade, which is crazy from everything you've just heard, right? But there were British historians at the time who were writing books saying, and the British are leading the fight against the slave trade, right? And so they're trying to argue that it's a Christian thing to be against the slave trade. And so they're the ones who start saying that those popes that condemned little aspects of slavery were really condemning slavery itself, you know? And so there is a really good chance that Gregory thought he was not the first pope to condemn the trade. But in his document, he says that. He says that the church has always been against it. Okay. No mention of Nicholas V, nothing like that. And again, my personal view, it's a hypothesis, is that he didn't even know about those bulls. There's just no evidence in those files that he thought that. All right. The church will eventually become fully abolitionist, full theological abolitionists. In the year 1888, Brazil is going to become the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery. And there is an abolitionist from Brazil who goes all the way to Rome to meet with Leo the 13th and says, Leo, would you please condemn slavery as being morally wrong? Not just the trade itself, but all of slavery as being totally morally wrong. He asked the right guy because Leo had already condemned slavery before when he was just a bishop. He was a full abolitionist. And he said, absolutely, I was already thinking about writing an encyclical. And he did. He wrote two encyclicals, one in 1888 and one in 1890, that denounced slavery as incompatible with Christianity. He uses fully abolitionist arguments, the same ones that Frederick Douglass used, and Maria Stuart and William Lloyd Garrison, Benjamin Lay. He uses fully Gregory of Nyssa. He uses all these arguments. And all the popes after him are going to confirm that. And even like strengthen it even more. So John Paul II will use theological language that he employed a lot to say that slaveholding is intrinsically evil, meaning that there never has been and never will be a situation when keeping another person as chattel property is morally acceptable, which is pretty much what Leo the 13th said too. But for John Paul II to say that in his encyclical on moral theology, which was all about that term intrinsic evil, that was a really big deal, and solidified that. And the popes since him have confirmed that teaching. However, Leo the 13th went even further than Gregory did on the history part too. And he said that all the popes had always been against slavery. And he named some that were slaveholders themselves. He named some who actually renewed Portugal's permissions to engage in the slave trade. And so it's he may have thought that was real, that was true, but it amounted to a cover-up, right? A cover-up of the truth. And unfortunately, today, there has still been no formal admission from the church that we were ever involved in the slave trade. And no admission or apology of it either. Okay, so last slide, and then we'll do some questions. I think we need to reckon with our past. If you go to, anybody know what that building is? Hey, African American History Museum, Smithsonian in DC, where I live. Okay, great museum. If you go first in the morning. Opens like 10 a.m. That's when you want to go, all right? Don't be like, oh, I'll go at 2. No, bad idea. 10 a.m. All right. If you go to this museum, the first floor, it's underground. The first floor is underground of the museum. It will have those quotes from Nicholas V on the wall about Pope Nicholas V allowing the slave trade to happen, okay? Now, this is not some anti-Catholic museum, it's just telling the truth of how the trade began. And this is like a museum of the United States Smithsonian. This is like our official museum. Like the United States has done a better job reckoning with its history of slaveholding than the Catholic Church has, right? It's doing a better job reckoning with the church's history of slaveholding than the church has, right? So we got to catch up here. And catching up is going to be really painful because it means admitting that our popes authorized the beginnings of the Atlantic slave trade and did not withdraw that authorization until nearly 400 years later. The trade caused millions of deaths, stolen labor and lives, physical and sexual violence, and a long legacy of racial inequality. And in the 19th century, papal documents basically rewrote the narrative to make it seem as if our hands had been clean the whole time. Now, I believe that the church's own theology of justice and our own theology of reconciliation requires that the church needs to engage in a process of truth-telling, of an apology, and of making some kind of repair for the harm that we have caused. We've got this great thing going on in the church right now, the synod on synodality. What if one day we did a synod on the church's relationship to slavery and colonialism and let people talk about that? You know, some people want to say, oh, that was so long ago. I'll tell you, I worked at a Black Catholic parish in Baton Rouge, my first year as a priest. And there were parishioners there whose grandparents were born into slavery. It is not that long ago. It is not that long ago. So, I hope that this is something that will happen, but you know, I can't make that happen on my own. Can't run a movement to get the Vatican to do this on my own. So I hope that you all will join with me in this struggle. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have.